This is Chapter 12, Part 3, Misuses of Power. One of the downsides to all of these power dynamics discussed in the chapter is that, especially when there's an unequal distribution of power, people will oftentimes abuse that. So first we have here the concept of sexual harassment. And now the book also recognizes that there are other types of harassment. And there's a whole example table of that on page 342 of your text that you might take a look at. But to begin here, we have, talking specifically about sexual harassment, you have quid pro quo harassment. Quid pro quo means something for something in Latin. So it's the suggestion of sexual favors or something like that in order to get a promotion or time off or something like that. So it's a suggestion of that. Not necessarily that it's carried out, but the suggestion that this is an option. And then if that suggestion is refused, oftentimes the environment will get worse for the person who did the refusing. Then there's hostile environment harassment, which just impacts the ability to work in the environment and be as efficient and as effective. So whether that's the telling of sexual jokes or just using sexual terms or gestures or something like that makes it a harder place to work, that's kind of what we're dealing with here. If you're trying to figure out if you are experiencing sexual harassment, if someone is aiming something towards you, if that's what you're witnessing between other coworkers, here's a list of questions that you can kind of ask yourself. Number one, is it real? You're trying to determine if the meaning is what it seems like it is, or if they might have possibly meant something else and just you misunderstood. And the second question, is it job related? So does this behavior have something to do with, or will it influence the way that you do your job? Because if it is job related, then you may not be dealing with a problem. Maybe just something to get used to. Maybe it's something you haven't experienced yet because you're new at the job or something. I would assume that this one's pretty rare. Then the next question, did you reject the behavior? Did you make it clear that it was unwelcome and unwarranted? And if you did so, then that's good. So that leads us to the last question here. Have the messages or have the occurrences persisted? Even after letting that person know that type of message was unwelcomed, did it continue? If you can answer yes to all four of these questions, then you might actually have a problem that needs to be dealt with. On the other side of things, oftentimes we're worried about saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. And so if you are trying to make sure that you are not going to be accused of sexual harassment or not accidentally commit it, some things you can think about here is, number one, begin with the assumption that coworkers are not interested in your advances. They're not interested in your jokes on that subject matter. Base your life on that assumption and you should be okay. Watch for negative reactions if you do cross that line, if you do tell sex-based jokes or use that type of language or things along those lines. But a good rule is to just avoid saying things that you wouldn't say to your grandparents or to a small child that you care about. If you can speak the way that you speak to those folks, you'll probably be okay and be able to avoid any unnecessary drama in the workplace regarding sexual harassment. If you are the target of sexual harassment, there are things to do. Number one, this is where it should start. Start by talking to the harasser. the one that's doing the harassment. Tell them it's unwelcomed, it's unwarranted, and you find it offensive. And you can tell them that if the problem persists, that you will take it up the chain of command if the threat is necessary. Then number 2, collect evidence so that it's not just hearsay, whether that's you get someone else to corroborate your story or you just write down who said what and when and kind of create a log. It's always good to have that kind of thing if you are bringing a charge against someone, even if it's not in a court of law. Begin with appropriate channels if you do have to take it up the chain of command. Most businesses have a protocol in place to deal with sexual harassment, whether that's going to your direct supervisor, if they're not the one doing the harassing, or it's or maybe it's going to the HR manager, human resources, and if that doesn't pay off, if that doesn't work and make the behavior stop, there are other avenues outside of the business that you can file with. State and federal organizations, people that help people dealing with sexual harassment, because it is illegal. The key thing is not to blame yourself. If someone is persistent in doing this kind of thing and breaking the law, essentially, then that's not your fault. But we do need to follow the correct protocols to make sure that these things are handled appropriately, but we don't need to just let them go either. Then we move on to bullying. Bullying is not the same as harassment. And a major difference between bullying and sexual harassment is that there is no protection under the law against bullying unless it has to do with a protected category. If you're the target of being bullied because of your race or because of your gender, then there's legal protections. But if it's just because that person is a jerk, because they're a bully, there's no protection under the law. But a lot of people are bullies and don't even realize that their behavior would constitute bullying. Being a gossip is considered bullying. It's talking badly about people behind their back, spreading rumors, or spreading truth that they don't want advertised. Treating others as inferior or excluding them. Maybe you've got that person in your workplace that's just kind of annoying to you, and so you always leave them out of everything. That's considered bullying. Name calling, of course, making faces at somebody, rolling your eyes when they start talking. That's considered bullying. Excessive blaming of someone who has maybe little or nothing to do with the problem, but putting it on them. The idea of overly supervising someone, being hypercritical, watching them very closely when it's unwarranted, that could be considered bullying. And then unnecessary or public criticism, calling somebody out in front of their peers whenever it's not necessary to do so. Generally speaking, it's not necessary to call someone out in front of their peers for a problem unless someone's safety is in danger. And the last one there is cyberbullying. It's probably a concept that you are fairly familiar with, given the age that we live in. But this is bullying that takes place through any electronic communication system and can take the form of sending threatening emails or images, posting negative comments, revealing secrets, or lying about another person via social media. So when we have to deal with bullying, we need to make sure, much like dealing with sexual harassment, that we oppose it. We don't just let it go unchecked. That's addressing it face to face with the person who's doing the bullying. So confront them if it's safe to do so. If it's something that's threatening, that needs to be dealt with by higher authority, such as supervisors or or something along those lines. I'm not talking about calling the police unless there's the threat of physical violence, then that might be the best course of action. But take action to defend yourself or another victim. If you see that someone else is the consistent victim of bullying, it might be time to step in and deal with that bully. Now, the good news is that statistically speaking, workplace bullying is purely verbal aggressiveness, verbal bullying. It's not quite like whenever you've got schoolyard bullies where they may push and shove and pick on the littlest kid that's out there on the playground. Once we graduate to the workplace, generally it becomes verbal in nature, verbal and psychological. Overall, that's good news because it takes away the physical aggression. The downside of that is sometimes it's harder to pin down and harder to prove, but it is something that can be dealt with. Another misuse of power is what's called a power play. Now, power plays are, again, can be a little bit more difficult to identify. And that's basically a power play is a pattern, not isolated incidents, of behavior that take unfair advantage of another person. So it's where someone just uses their power to get someone to do something for them repeatedly. So we can ignore power plays. If that person doesn't have the actual authority to do that kind of thing, we can ignore it. We can attempt to neutralize it to where we basically call it out as a power play and then walk away. The hope is that they won't try to do it in the future if you call them out. Or there's the idea of cooperating, which is where you would call it out, counter it by saying, here's the problem I have with what you're doing, and then giving them an alternative to deal with whatever problem they may have with you. So there's several different types of power plays here. Got the nobody upstairs power play, where you make a request of somebody and they just flat ignore you. They refuse to acknowledge your request to stop bullying you, or or in some cases you make a request and they won't take no for an answer. Basically, they'll make you do it. They'll insist to the point where you go ahead and go along with it. There's the you owe me power play, where they do something maybe that you didn't ask them to do in order to indebt you to them. And then they'll bring up that indebtedness on occasion. Say, hey, I got you those floor seats for that game, remember? You owe me. They'll make you feel guilty enough that you may go ahead and do what they're asking. There's the you gotta be kidding me power play, where they'll make statements very similar to that, just dismissing whatever problem it is that you may bring up. There's using metaphors, and as the book indicates, this may be difficult to recognize as a power play, but this is where they'll use language and metaphor in order to create an image in somebody's mind. So what they're doing here is they're trying to, more often than not, trying to make it seem like whatever you're doing is wrong or weird or gross, in order to make you want to disassociate yourself from that, or to make others look down on you if you continue to do so. And then there's the thought-stopping power play. This is where someone interrupts, completes your thought for you, screams at you, does something to divert the attention from whatever it was you were trying to say back to them so that they can do the talking and nobody has to listen to you. It's controlling the conversation, it's being dominant and dismissive of another party.